Hello and welcome. There's a con artist who has an extraordinary ability to manipulate his victims, almost like a puppet master, where he gains full control over their lives. Most of his victims are women, and he uses two main tactics to ensnare them, either through a fabricated love story or by instilling fear and intimidation. He masterfully alternates between these two approaches until he has complete control over the victim, ultimately destroying her life. His primary goal is to extort money, not just from the victim but also from those around her, such as her parents and relatives. What makes this con artist particularly dangerous is his exceptional psychological manipulation skills, which have left even law enforcement and the media astonished. He has earned the nickname Puppet Master because of how he controls his victims as if they were puppets, moving them exactly how he desires. His story is filled with unbelievable events that might seem exaggerated or even fictional to some, but I assure you that everything I'm about to share is 100% true, backed by testimonies, court records, and media documentation. His criminal activities started in the 1990s, but before delving into his older cases, I'll begin by recounting his latest one, which began in 2012. Brace yourselves for a bizarre and shocking tale that feels stranger than fiction. This is a family consisting of a father named Mark, a mother named Sandra, and two children, the eldest daughter, Sophie, and the son, Jake. They lived in London. The family's story began when Mark and Sandra met during their childhood. A relationship developed between them, leading to marriage in their early 20s. Over the years, they had their first child, Sophie, followed by Jake. Although their marriage was built on love, the relationship started to cool off over time. There were no major conflicts, but they decided to separate in 2011. After the separation, Mark and Sandra maintained a strong connection to co-parent their children and kept a good relationship for their sake. Later on, Sandra decided she wanted to start dating again, so she turned to online dating platforms. She created a profile with her pictures, details about herself, her likes and dislikes. Through one of these platforms, she met a man named David, an Indian who lived in the same city. Sandra and David started a romantic relationship, and soon David became involved in the family's life. David met Sophie and Jake and began building a good relationship with them. At the time, Jake was 15 years old, and Sophie was 16. The children noticed that David seemed successful and financially well off. He worked at a major advertising company and had a penchant for luxury, especially cars. One day, the children were surprised to see their mother driving a brand new Audi, which they learned was a gift from David. Sandra was delighted with the car. Later, David took the family on a trip to Spain, a special experience for the children as they had never been to Europe before. This was the family's first trip, and everyone was excited and happy. Upon arriving in Spain, David took charge of organizing their schedule, and they had a great time exploring and enjoying various places. However, the children noticed something strange. Whenever they passed through passport checkpoints or airports, David was extremely cautious with their passports, making sure no one else saw them. This behavior seemed odd but not alarming at first. The reason behind it would only become clear later. Over time, David's relationship with Sandra, the mother, deepened to the point where he started staying at their house regularly. Eventually, his presence became so frequent that it felt like he was living with them permanently. His move into their home happened gradually, with him bringing his belongings little by little until, before they knew it, he was fully integrated into their daily lives. David became a central figure in Sandra's life and her children's household. He often talked about his wealth and the things he planned to buy for her. Although he claimed to work in an advertising company, the children noticed that he rarely left the house, which they found odd. What was even stranger was how Sandra herself started to change. Before David entered her life, Sandra maintained a good relationship with her ex-husband Mark, the father of her children. They co-parented the kids amicably. However, with David's arrival, this relationship began to deteriorate. Sandra became increasingly preoccupied with David, neglecting her children noticeably. She stopped communicating with Mark about the kids' needs and well-being and even ignored his calls and messages. Mark wasn't the only one affected by this change. Sandra gradually distanced herself from all her friends and close connections. Her entire life began to revolve around David, to the extent that even her relationship with her children became shallow. She no longer inquired about their studies or needs, treating them almost like strangers living under the same roof. The situation worsened when conflicts began to arise. One day, a gold bracelet David had bought for Sandra went missing. Sandra accused her son Jake of stealing it. She yelled at him while Jake stood in shock, insisting, "How can you accuse me of stealing? I'm your son." Meanwhile, David stood behind Sandra, playing the role of the disappointed father. What none of them knew at the time was that David himself had stolen the bracelet. This incident was just one example of the troubles he brought into their lives. Sandra's relationship with her children deteriorated significantly due to repeated conflicts between them. She lost trust in them, viewing them as ill-mannered, troublesome, and disobedient. Meanwhile, the children felt they were living in a strange and unwelcoming environment. None of them realized that David was the root cause of these problems, as he deliberately interfered in their affairs in a harmful way, as if he aimed to make their lives more miserable. Among his negative actions, David falsely told Mark, the children's biological father, that Jake was gay, even though it wasn't true, solely to stir up trouble. He also placed a piece of metal inside Jake's shoe, claiming it would make the shoe last longer. However, it caused the shoe to produce an annoying noise with every step. Despite Jake's objections, David forced him to wear the shoe to school, leading to immense embarrassment as his classmates mocked and bullied him. Things didn't stop there. When Jake returned home from school, he often found the front door locked and had to wait for long periods before anyone opened it for him. On many occasions, the door remained locked for hours, forcing Jake to leave and come back repeatedly. According to his sister Sophie, David forbade anyone from opening the door for Jake, and Sandra would obey him completely, as if she were under his control. Jake's psychological state deteriorated severely. One day, after finding the door locked yet again, he lost control and began banging on the back door with all his strength, shouting in desperation. Sophie, watching from her bedroom window, decided to intervene and open the back door for him. Jake entered the house utterly broken, telling his sister that he couldn't endure it any longer. He resolved to pack his belongings and leave the house for good. Jake's sister started crying desperately, begging him not to leave her alone, but she couldn't change his mind. Jake told her he couldn't bear this life anymore, so he decided to go live with his father. It wasn't clear why she didn't go with him, but he left that night and never came back. Jake kept wondering, why was David treating him this way? What was his real goal? It seemed that David wanted to get rid of Jake, seeing him as a threat to his control over Sandra, Jake's mother, and Sophie. In the end, David got what he wanted. He became the sole authority over the mother and daughter, while the father and son were completely out of the picture. One of the reasons Sophie stayed and didn't leave with her brother was perhaps because David hadn't treated her as badly as he treated Jake. She felt uncomfortable, but she hadn't reached the breaking point like Jake. Maybe she wasn't ready to leave the home she had lived in all her life, or to leave her school and friends. It's not an easy thing, especially for a girl her age. A year passed since David entered their lives. In 2013, Sophie began feeling very lonely, especially after Jake left. Her mother had changed so much and became a stranger to her. She lost contact with her father and brother entirely. The only person she interacted with was David, who started filling her mind with twisted ideas. Gradually, he convinced her that her father was a bad person, that he had abandoned her mother and left her in her time of need. David portrayed himself as the hero who saved her mother from the misery caused by her father. Day by day, he continued planting these poisonous thoughts in Sophie's mind. With a chilling skill, he convinced her that her father had also abandoned her and no longer wanted her in his life, just like he had abandoned her mother. He made her believe that Jake had also left her behind without a second thought. He planted in her mind the idea that she was unwanted, and that connecting with her father or brother was not only impossible but also unacceptable. Now, whenever she thought about her father, she only saw a frightening person who might harm her. David was disturbingly skilled at manipulating his victims' emotions, especially women and girls. We may not fully understand how he did it, but what's certain is that what's coming in this story will be 1,000,000 times more shocking. This person has an enormous amount of malice, to the point where he can manipulate people in a terrifying way. He has an unbelievable ability to persuade, and most importantly, he knows exactly how to choose his victims, because not everyone can be manipulated like that. Sophie and her mother were completely isolated from the world, as David cut them off. Sophie's father, Mark, tried to contact her multiple times. He wrote her messages and tried to reach out, but it was all in vain. She was the one who refused to communicate and told him, "Don't talk to me." It wasn't David who was preventing her from speaking to him, it was her own decision to cut ties with him after he convinced her that her father was a bad person, who had abandoned her and wanted to harm her. So, she chose to reject him and stay away by her own will. Her father was confused and couldn't do anything. Even when he went to see her, she would run away from him. He couldn't involve the authorities or the police because it was she who decided to cut ties with him. Imagine that she didn't speak to or see her father for 2.5 years, all because of the mind manipulation David had done on her. Mark, Sophie's father, was puzzled by what was happening, and it was clear to him that David was behind all of this, but he didn't understand the reason behind his actions. Why was he doing this? Why was he separating them and isolating the mother and daughter from everyone around them? Mark tried to search for David more. He looked up his full name, David Hindi, searched the internet, social media, and even checked the local phone directory, but he found no information about him. Usually, even if a person tries to hide themselves, there's always something that can be found about them, like their address or phone number registered under their name, or any other information related to them. But David Hendy seemed to be non-existent, like a ghost, during the 2.5 years that Sophie was cut off from her father. During this time, she dropped out of school and didn't attend college or university. David got her a job at a beauty salon as an intern, where she worked as a hairdresser, but she wasn't a regular employee. Sophie lived in her parents' house and was required to pay rent, which was £300. From her salary, she was left with only £100, and this money was supposed to go to her mother, even though the house was in her father's name. However, it was David who took this money under the pretense that he would give it to her mother, but he kept it for himself. David also discovered that Sophie had a savings account with £10,000 in the bank, money she had saved up over the years, and a large portion of this was from her father to help her continue her studies. When David found out about this account, he laughed wickedly and convinced her to withdraw the money to buy a car for herself. He was the one who drove her to work every day and treated her poorly, sometimes being hours late, forcing her to wait for him until late at night. One day, Sophie had to sleep in the living room due to difficult circumstances. When David found out about the £10,000 in her account, he suggested using the money to buy a car instead of continuing to live in such a tough situation. He convinced her to go to the bank and withdraw the money in cash, and then took the money from her, claiming he would buy her a car. But after that, David disappeared with the money and was never seen again. Sophie was going through the worst days of her life and felt extremely suffocated. She began to feel the same way her brother did when he left the house 2 years ago. At that point, she decided to follow his lead and leave too. Even though she had been living with David, she didn't have anyone to turn to. She cut ties with everyone around her because of David, even her father and brother. After leaving, she rented a small apartment and lived alone, and didn't contact her father or brother for a full year. Despite the long separation, her father, Mark, never lost hope and continued trying to reach out to her. Eventually, Sophie started communicating with him again, and she was afraid of his reaction due to the manipulation David had done on her mind. However, her father reassured her that he still loved her and wanted to be a part of her life. When they reconnected, they embraced her warmly, and this happened in late 2014. A short time later, Mark and his children discovered that David and Sandra had suddenly disappeared from the house, and no one knew where they had gone. Mark decided to visit the house, which was in his name, to check for any issues that might need repairing before selling it. But the shock came when he found that the door to the master bedroom was locked with a heavy-duty lock, one that is typically used to trap someone inside a room. When he examined the room, he found that the window was completely covered with newspaper, making it impossible to see inside. Mark also discovered that all the bills were unpaid, with final warnings for overdue payments, including phone, electricity, water bills, and even court summonses for unpaid debts. It turned out that David and Sandra had been living in a mountain of debt, including a loan for the car that David had promised to give to Sandra. It also became clear that David wasn't as wealthy as he had claimed to be. In fact, he had been living off Sandra's money and taking everything he could get his hands on. This was likely the reason why they suddenly disappeared, and it remains unclear what their next plans are. Mark decided to try again and search for David's past, but once again, the paths were blocked, and the leads were closed. However, an idea came to him. He typed David Hindi into Google along with the words "con man." That's when Mark discovered something he never expected. Articles appeared about a professional con artist named Robert Hindi Freegard. The police had described this con artist as pure evil, operating at a level far beyond any other con artist in the world. The media dubbed him the Puppet Master because he had the ability to brainwash his victims and manipulate them like puppets. Robert Hindi Freegard managed to manipulate a large number of victims, extorted money from them, and stole over £2 million. He was a convicted con artist who had been tried in 2003 and sentenced to prison, but he was later released. When Mark saw images of this con artist, he was shocked to realize that it was the same person as David. Suddenly, everything started making sense, and all the questions Mark had been asking were answered when he read about the details of this con artist's life and how he used to lure and exploit his victims. What was even crazier is that Robert Hindi Freegard had been impersonating an agent in the British Security Service, MI5, and convinced his victims that he was a spy working for the government, carrying out secret missions. We'll leave Mark, Sandra, and their children for now and return to their story at the end of the video. But for now, let's go back to the past and see how David, or rather Robert Freegard, conned his victims and the crazy things he did in his past. Let's go back to 1993, with this man in the picture in front of you, named John Edkeston. This is a recent photo of him, but we'll use it for the context of 1993. At that time, John was just starting college at Harper Adams University, which was considered one of the best agricultural colleges in all of England. Keep this information in mind because it's important. During this period in 1992 to 1993, Britain, especially England, was going through a time of instability due to the attacks and bombings carried out by the Irish Republican Army, IRA, across the country. The Irish Army was not a traditional army, but rather a paramilitary organization formed from the remnants of the previous Irish Army, and they called themselves the Irish Army. This organization was classified by Britain as a terrorist group, and British authorities were constantly pursuing its members. The conflict between Britain and the Irish Army was due to Northern Ireland, which was and still is part of Britain. The Irish Army wanted to reclaim Northern Ireland from British control, so the organization declared war on Britain and began carrying out bombings and random shootings across England. People in England lived in constant fear and anxiety, as bombings could happen anywhere, and the Irish Army had supporters and undercover agents among the civilians, especially since there was a large Irish community in England. The history between the two countries is long and complex. John, a student at the agricultural college, attended a school with many Irish students. One of these students was arrested after it was discovered that he was smuggling weapons for the Irish Army agents in England. Following this, the students in the college realized that the authorities and security forces were closely monitoring them, and there was a possibility that undercover officers were among them. John had some Irish friends, and suddenly, one of these friends committed suicide using a firearm. This incident was a shock to John, as he couldn't understand why his friend had committed suicide. He fell into a deep state of sadness, so he decided to go to a nearby bar to drink and calm down. While there, he started talking to the bartender, whose name was Robert. Yes, this is the same Robert Freegard, whom we knew at the beginning of the story as David. At that time, Robert was a young man in his early 20s, about the same age as John. Robert began chatting with John and learned about the story of his Irish friend who had committed suicide. John told him he didn't know why his friend had killed himself, but the police said it was a suicide. Robert immediately replied, "Do you really believe your friend committed suicide?" John confirmed, saying, "Yes, the police said he did." Robert then said, "Your friend didn't commit suicide. The Irish Army killed him." John was shocked and asked, "Why? What does the Irish Army have to do with this?" Robert explained, "Your friend was working with them. Do you remember the student who was arrested for smuggling weapons for the Irish? Do you think he was working alone? Of course not. He was working with other agents, and your friend was one of them. He probably saw something he wasn't supposed to see, so they got rid of him." John was stunned by what Robert was saying and asked, "How do you know all of this?" Robert responded, "I'm not who you think I am. What you see is just a cover. I don't work in the bar. I'm an agent in the British Security Service, MI5. I'm a spy." At that moment, John was confused and shocked, not fully understanding what was happening, but at the same time, he had suspected there might be agents watching the college, so he wasn't completely surprised by the idea that there were agents in the area. What was strange, though, was that one of these secret agents was revealing his identity to him. Why would a secret agent expose himself? Robert then took John to the second floor of the bar, where he lived in an apartment provided by the security service. He showed John around the apartment and explained that the security service had arranged for him to live there temporarily. He pointed to some boxes and said, "I haven't even unpacked my things because I'm living here on a temporary basis." He continued to convince John that he was truly an MI5 agent, showing him some tools and even a special watch, saying it was a spy watch with special features. Robert also took advantage of a recent bombing that had occurred that morning in a nearby area and used it to further convince John that his story was true. All these details, combined with Robert's persuasive manner, made John fall into the trap and believe that Robert was indeed an agent of MI5. Robert kept explaining, even telling John how the main components used in making bombs, like diesel and fertilizer, were commonly found in farming areas like the agricultural college where they were studying, and that many of the Irish agents in the college were trying to get their hands on these materials to make more bombs. Robert overwhelmed John with a lot of information to the point where his mind was spinning. Some might think John was foolish for believing such things, as any security agent should never reveal themselves like that, especially to a student. However, Robert was skilled in persuasion and had an ability to convince others in ways that are hard to imagine or understand. When John asked him why he was telling him all of this and what he wanted from him, Robert told him that he needed his help. He said, "We suspect that some of your roommates are involved with the Irish Army. We've confirmed that you're clean, we've checked your past, and everything about you is fine. But we need your help to observe your roommates. When you go back, pay attention to their movements and the way they speak. If you suspect anyone, let me know." Instead of doubting Robert's words, John became filled with patriotic zeal, thinking he would work with the security service and become a spy, helping them catch the terrorists who were bombing, killing, and destroying the country. Once Robert saw that he had convinced John, he said, "You need some training. Anyone who works with us, even temporarily, needs to be strong." Robert then took John to a gym with training equipment and began teaching him how to box and how to endure punches. According to John, Robert seemed to enjoy hitting him, but he made it appear like a test of John's endurance to see if he was fit to work with the security service and become a spy. Robert skillfully manipulated him, making it seem as if John was the one eager to join, not the other way around. He told him that he had to endure the training and tests to become stronger and qualified for the job. Furthermore, Robert managed to convince him that he needed to change his appearance to hide his identity, suggesting he dye his hair red and wear different clothes than he usually did. Robert seemed to be testing how much control he had over John, and indeed, John had become like a puppet in his hands, doing anything Robert asked without hesitation. Of course, this didn't happen overnight. Robert was gradually building his influence over John. He started by assigning him tasks to monitor their dorm mates. John was instructed to track their movements, record their car license plate numbers, and observe where they went and whom they spoke to. This continued for several months, to the point where John began skipping classes and lectures to complete these assignments. Robert also convinced him that the intelligence agency would financially compensate him and that if he succeeded, he could have a future as an agent or spy like Robert, with a respectable salary. The financial incentive and the promise of a bright future were key elements Robert used to motivate and control John. But this wasn't where it ended. Robert even began meddling in John's personal life. John had a roommate named Sarah Smith, who came from a wealthy family, and it's important to emphasize that her family was very wealthy. Robert convinced John to pursue Sarah and try to make her his girlfriend. John would have never considered such a thing before, but Robert managed to reshape his personality entirely. So, John started approaching Sarah, flirting with her a little, inviting her to dinner, and they eventually began dating, all thanks to Robert's manipulation. Now, if you look at this picture, on the right we have John, and on the left, Sarah, who is now his girlfriend. The young man in the center is named Jim, and we'll come back to him shortly. The woman in the photo is Maria Hindi. You might be wondering why her last name is the same as Robert's. The reason is simple. Before all of this started, and before Robert met John in the bar and told him about his friend who had committed suicide, Maria was involved in events that we'll explore later. Robert was dating a girl named Maria, who was his girlfriend at the time. However, Robert didn't randomly target John. Their first meeting at the bar wasn't a coincidence. Before starting his plan, Robert had gathered information about Maria's acquaintances and personalities. John and Sarah, who had now become a couple, were part of his plan from the beginning because both of their families were wealthy. He brought them together as a couple to move on to the second phase of his plan. It's important to note that Maria, who was Robert's girlfriend, was also a victim of his manipulation, as she wasn't part of the plan at that time. Now, to move forward with the second phase of his plan, Robert needed to convince John and Sarah that they were in danger, that they were being targeted by the Irish army. One of the people Robert had John monitor was their dorm mate, Jim, the guy who had been in the picture with them. Robert told John that security officials suspected Jim of being an undercover agent for the Irish army. This claim was made more believable because Jim was actually Irish, which made John more likely to believe it. Since John's mind had been almost completely manipulated by Robert, he started believing that Jim was an undercover agent, and that he and Sarah were now targets of the Irish army because Jim had reported them. To further support this lie, Robert used the fact that John's car had been stolen, making the whole situation seem even more real to him. Suddenly, Sarah disappeared, and her car had all its windows, front and rear, smashed, as if it were a threatening message. Of course, the person behind this was Robert, who did it to make John believe the lie even more. John was now convinced that he and Sarah were in danger and that they were being targeted by the Irish army. So, he asked Robert what they should do and how they could get out of this mess. Robert told him, "You and Sarah need to escape the city, and I will help you. I'll come with you." He also convinced John that their roommate, Maria, was also a target, and that the Irish army might have reported them all. Robert's plan was to take them all together, John, Sarah, and Maria. John asked, "How will we convince them to escape with us?" Robert replied, "We'll tell them you're working for the security agency, and that they need to escape with us." But Robert explained that he wouldn't tell them about his involvement with the security agency, because they might not believe him right away. He added, "We need to leave now, time is running out, and we don't know when the Irish army might act against us." John asked, "What do we do then? How will we convince them to come with us?" Robert said, "I want you to tell Sarah and Maria that you have cancer, and that the doctor said you only have a few months left to live. Tell them that your last wish is to go on a trip around the country and visit different cities before you die." As we mentioned before, John's mind had been completely manipulated, and he was ready to believe anything Robert said. So he agreed to the plan and went to Sarah and Maria to tell them about his cancer diagnosis, saying it was his last wish to take a trip with them to enjoy life before his death. The two girls were shocked, especially Sarah, but they immediately agreed to his request, knowing he was in a terminal condition and wouldn't have asked for anything if it weren't serious. That same day, they packed their things, told their families they were going on a trip that might last 2 weeks around the country. There was no objection from their families since they were all adults in their early 20s, and they were free to make their own decisions. At the start of the trip, John, Sarah, and Maria were together in Sarah's car, traveling around the country and visiting different cities. After 10 days of traveling, they met up with Robert. John introduced him as a friend, although Sarah didn't know Robert, while Maria did because he was her boyfriend. However, Robert had previously told Maria not to reveal their relationship, and that he would explain everything to her later. The details of Robert's relationship with Maria were unclear, as she hadn't spoken to the media about it. Only she knew the full story of their relationship. At first, John and Sarah believed the story from their perspective, while the details from Maria's side were less clear. However, it seems that Maria was also deceived like them. After 10 days of their trip, Robert met with them and allowed John to tell them the truth, that he wasn't suffering from cancer and wasn't dying. Robert then revealed his true identity as an agent of the British Security Service, MI5, and explained that the real purpose of the trip wasn't a leisure getaway, but to escape the Irish Army. He told them that their roommate, Jim, was actually an agent for the Irish Army, and that their lives were in danger and they were being targeted. This was the reason why John had lied about having cancer. He was fully convinced by everything Robert told him. Maria, on the other hand, was Robert's girlfriend, and he had manipulated her as well. Sarah, however, was the one who might have questioned the story, but since she trusted John and loved him, she believed him when she saw that he was convinced. One of the tricks Robert used to convince Sarah was that he knew the exact amount of money in her bank account. No one knew how he obtained this information, but he was able to tell her the exact balance. He explained that he knew this because he really worked for the security service. If he hadn't, there was no way he could have known that information. The chaos and bombings that were happening in different parts of England at the time, especially the events at their college, also helped convince them. As a result, all three, John, Sarah, and Maria, became convinced that they were indeed targeted by the Irish Army. Now, as viewers, many of you may have doubts about this story. To be honest, even I found it strange while researching the story. I started questioning the events myself, wondering how they could have been so easily deceived. But after checking multiple sources, I confirmed that these events were indeed real. I'm telling you this because it sets the stage for the next part of the story, which is even harder to believe due to how bizarre it is. But it really happened. I still can't fully grasp how this happened, but I'm about to tell you the biggest part of the story, and then we'll dive into the details. After Robert took the three of them, John, Sarah, and Maria, on this so-called great escape from the Irish Army, they never saw their families again for years. They spent all that time on this supposed escape, and Robert controlled them like puppets. He led them through one of the biggest and longest lies of their lives. I know this may be hard to believe, but I'm going to tell you the story. If anyone wants to verify these events themselves, they can find tons of credible sources. There are documentaries, books, articles from major British newspapers, testimonies from victims and their families, court case files, police records, and interrogation transcripts that confirm all these events. There's a long list of reliable sources that back up what happened. After they left on the trip and Robert convinced them that he was an agent of MI5, they kept moving from one city to another, never staying in any city for more than 2 nights. Besides Robert's incredible persuasive skills, luck was also on his side. For example, after they left a town called Warrington, where they had stayed for 2 nights, 2 bombings occurred the next day, bombings carried out by the Irish Army. This increased their belief that they were truly being targeted and that Robert's story was real. But things became even more complicated when Robert told them that they had to remain completely hidden, meaning they couldn't contact their families. He said doing so would put them and their families in danger. A week, 2 weeks, and 3 weeks passed in this escape, and they had no contact with their families. Naturally, Sarah's father began to worry, especially since she hadn't been in touch. After some time, he decided to call John's family, and they told him they hadn't heard from John either during the past few weeks. Sarah's father became concerned and was about to call the police to report her as missing. But then, out of the blue, the phone rang. It was Sarah calling. Somehow, Robert had gotten wind of Sarah's father's inquiries and knew he was looking for them everywhere. So, to prevent the situation from escalating, Robert decided that Sarah should call her father and reassure him that everything was fine. Sarah told him they were doing well and that they were planning to visit him at home. So, the four of them, Sarah, John, Maria, and Robert, went to Sarah's house in the middle of the night. It was a strange situation, and Sarah's father didn't understand what was going on. The four of them entered the house, and Sarah's father sat with them. He knew John and Maria since John was Sarah's boyfriend and Maria was her friend, but this was the first time he'd met Robert. He immediately sensed that something was off about Robert. Robert was confident in a strange way, speaking with such authority, as though he was trying to control the conversation and dominate the space. Robert instructed the others to stick to their original lie, that John had cancer and was living out his last months. He said they were on this trip because of that, and they planned to continue it for a few more weeks. To help convince them to lie to Sarah's father, Robert told them that if they told him the truth, that the Irish army was after them and wanted to kill them, it would only make him more worried and could potentially put him in danger, making him a target as well. Abu Sarah wasn't convinced by what was being said, and he didn't even believe that John was sick. Normally, a sick person would be tired, but John was more scared than exhausted. He wasn't just scared, he was terrified, and his whole body would shake from fear as he spoke. This made Abu Sarah feel that something was strange, especially with the new person who was with them, named Robert. But in the end, he couldn't stop them from doing what they wanted, so they stayed that night at Sarah's house. The next morning, Sarah hugged her father and said goodbye, and they got in their car and returned to the road. At that moment, Sarah didn't know she wouldn't see her father again for 10 years. This incident and the meeting at the house are recounted by the father himself, as well as by Sarah and John, who confirm the same story. After this meeting, the children disappeared again without a trace. The father waited for weeks without any contact from his daughter or the person with her, and they didn't return to college. They had completely disappeared, just like before. Sarah came from a wealthy family, and her father was the one paying for her expenses and credit cards. During their journey around the country, it wasn't Robert who was paying, he was using Sarah's cards. As for John, he came from a family with a decent income, but they weren't as wealthy as Sarah's family. His family owned farms, which is why John attended an agricultural college. Throughout the trip, Robert was using their money to fund himself and the journey, claiming that the government would reimburse them after the crisis ended, and that there was a funding program from the security services that would cover all their expenses. But this claim didn't make sense, and it shouldn't have been believed. Yet, they fell into his trap, and this might have been one of Robert's key skills. He knew how to choose his victims. He knew these three came from wealthy families and had likely studied their personalities, weaknesses, and ways of thinking. Father of Sarah was paying for his daughter's expenses and could see the bills coming from different cities as they traveled. He noticed they were moving quickly, trying to avoid being tracked. He even made a map of their movements based on the bills that came to his daughter's account and noticed that their movements were strange. They were only staying in one place for 1 or 2 nights, and it was normal for them to travel from the north to the south of the country in one day. The expenses were also huge, including hotels, restaurants, fuel, and even clothes. This made him even more suspicious because Sarah was always careful with money and didn't waste it. The father began to suspect that his daughter might have been caught up with a scam artist trying to steal her money. With the growing anxiety and the long period they had been gone, now over a month, he decided to report to the police. But the police response was simple: his daughter was an adult, and according to his account, she was traveling by her own choice, and there was no evidence that she was kidnapped. Therefore, they couldn't intervene in the matter. After more than a month and a half, Sarah called again and told her father that the trip would take longer than they had planned and that she would postpone her graduation from college to the next year. The father tried to reason with her, but Sarah didn't give him the chance to speak. She told him she needed to discover herself more. She ended the call without allowing him to try to change her mind. This was all done under Robert's influence, and all the words she said to her father were scripted by him. The children stayed missing for 6 months, and the parents were confused, not knowing what to do. The only one trying to take action was Abu Sarah, who kept trying to convince the police to get involved, but to no avail. The police kept telling him that since there was no kidnapping involved, it wasn't their responsibility. Finally, father of Sarah realized that he had to find his daughter himself. The thing that could have helped him was the credit card, as the expenses would show him where they were currently, in which city and place. He started trying to track his daughter and moved from city to city, contacting the places they had been, such as restaurants, hotels, and rental rooms. However, their fast and constant movements made the situation difficult. Robert kept moving them from place to place, especially after he received news that Sarah's father was trying to track him by calling the restaurants and hotels they had stayed at. Sometimes, the owners of these places would inform him about someone who asked about them. For this reason, Robert kept moving them more, claiming that the Irish army was tracking them, while in reality, it was Sarah's father trying to trouble them. Eventually, Sarah's father managed to find one of the houses they had rented in Peterborough. They had just rented it that same day, and Sarah's father arrived at night, expecting to find them there. Indeed, he was able to break into the house through a rear window. However, when he entered, he found the house empty. Still, in one of the rooms, he found some belongings that belonged to Sarah, indicating that Robert had likely moved them quickly because they left some of their things behind. It seemed that Robert had realized Sarah's father was getting closer to them and made them leave hastily. That was the closest Sarah's father came to tracking his daughter, but he continued to try for the following months without success. Despite everything that had happened, he knew that his daughter, John, and most likely Maria, were victims of a scam by a professional con artist. However, he could not understand how Robert had managed to fully manipulate all 3 of them over these months. Robert had emotionally and psychologically controlled them through fear and terror, destroying their relationships with their families and friends, and isolating them completely from the world. He created a new world for them and made them live in it. Even now, everyone wonders how Robert did it. They try to figure out a logical way, but they can't comprehend it. What is known is that Robert gradually isolated them from the world until he had total control over them. They began obeying everything he wanted. Now, they tell their story and don't understand how they were deceived in this way. They say they felt bewitched or hypnotized, and that they weren't kidnapped or forced to come with him. It was a psychological and mental control process, through which he convinced them that they were being targeted by the Irish army, putting them in a constant state of fear. This allowed him to move them from place to place and control every aspect of their lives according to his will. He literally reshaped and rebuilt them from within. For example, he changed their real names. John became Jimmy, and Sarah became Betty, and he made them get used to these new names until they forgot their real names. He even changed their appearances, like with Sarah, who he made cut her hair short and dye it blonde. In addition, he warned them never to speak about their past to anyone, because it could attract the attention of the Irish army. In this way, he gave them new identities and isolated them not just from their families and friends, but also from their past and their real selves. The way he did this is something that should be studied in psychology. After several months of constant moving, Robert even separated them. John was in one city, Sarah in another, and Maria in a third city. He claimed that this separation was ordered by higher-ups in the security agency, who believed it was the safest option for them. As for Maria, we know the least about her, since, as I mentioned, she didn't appear in the media and hasn't shared her story. But what we do know about her will shock Robert. Over the years, Maria married and had 2 daughters. According to the information I obtained, the marriage was part of a plan to seize her inheritance because her family still had money. Although her father had 2 daughters from her, he did not succumb to the extortion. He married her in order to take control of her inheritance after her death. This is the information I have about Maria, but I don't have the full details of her story. There are other details that we will mention later. As for John and Sarah, Robert arranged jobs for each of them. John got a job as a waiter in a bar, and Sarah got a job in a fast food restaurant. These were difficult jobs, requiring long hours and low pay. Robert managed to turn their lives into a monotonous and exhausting routine. They worked 10 hours a day, and in the remaining time, he assigned them surveillance tasks. He would make them monitor certain places, people, or cars, recording car license plates and tracking people's movements. These tasks had no real value. They were just meant to keep them busy with espionage-like activities. This situation contributed to a constant pressure on them, especially with the increasing attacks and bombings carried out by the Irish Army in Britain, such as shootings, building explosions, store bombings, and even bus bombings. Robert took advantage of these incidents to continue deceiving John and Sarah, who were living under constant stress and fear, with their mental state completely shattered. On the other hand, Sarah's father was trying to track them down without success and was in contact with John's family. It seems that John informed his family about the threats from the Irish Army and that they were fleeing from them with an agent in the security service. Robert may have allowed John to share this information with his family in order to extort money from them, under the pretense that the money would be used to protect their son. John's family, who seemed to be more emotional, easily fell for this trick and kept sending money, believing it was for their son's protection. In reality, the money went straight into Robert's pocket. Eventually, Sarah's father learned from John's family about the fake Irish Army threat and the lies about them being targeted. Although he couldn't fully understand how his children had fallen for this deception, he realized that the entire scheme was aimed at seizing their money. Robert's only goal was to take money from each family. John's family was the easiest to deal with, as with just a phone call from John, Robert could easily get £10,000 or £20,000. This money continued to flow over the years, eventually reaching £400,000, as mentioned. However, Sarah's family, especially her mother's side, was harder to deal with. After a while, Robert stopped paying for the credit cards Sarah was using, causing the money to stop flowing. At that point, Robert started pressuring Sarah to find a way to get more money to continue her protection from the Irish Army. Sarah knew that she had an inheritance from her family's wealth, amounting to £200,000, but this inheritance was locked in a special bank account that she couldn't access without her father's approval. Technically, the money belonged to her, but she needed her father's permission to access it. When Robert learned about this inheritance, he became greedy for it and decided to allow Sarah to contact her father after more than a year of being cut off. The last time Sarah saw her father was when he visited her at home, and the last time she spoke to him was in early 1993, when she told him she wouldn't continue her studies. Over the course of the year, she wasn't allowed to contact him, as Robert made sure there was no communication with her family, knowing that her father was the one most likely to object to his actions. But when he realized that the only way to get more money from Sarah was through contacting her father, he decided to allow it. When Sarah called her father, it was a shock and surprise to him to hear his daughter's voice after such a long time. As soon as he started to warn her about Robert and his intentions to take her money, Robert, who was standing beside her, immediately hung up the phone. He realized that her contact with her father was a threat, as he knew her father would not easily comply. After that phone call, Robert forbade Sarah from speaking to her father again for another 4 years. During these 4 years, as mentioned, he isolated her from John and Maria, and made her work in a fast food restaurant. Even the little money she earned from that job was taken by him. Sometimes, he would leave her without money or food for long periods, and she sometimes had to live for weeks on leftovers from the restaurant. Despite all this, Robert continually pressured her, telling her that the money wasn't enough for her protection. By 1998, after 5 years of suffering, Robert had married Maria and had 2 daughters with her. The details of their life are not well known, but it is likely that the marriage was primarily to gain control of her inheritance. As for John, his family continued to pay him regularly, and they were submissive to him, making him like the cash cow for Robert. However, Sarah was the most difficult case, as her father refused to cooperate and was the most troublesome for Robert. As we mentioned before, there was an inheritance allocated to Sarah from her family's wealth, worth £200,000. Robert was greedy for this money and decided to make Sarah reconnect with her father again to try to get the inheritance, but this time, he intended to use a new strategy. Although Sarah hadn't been in contact with her father for 4 years, when Robert told her that she should call him to try to get the inheritance, she wasn't excited. In fact, the call was burdensome for her, as her family and father had become distant figures from the past. She was now living a completely different life. Robert had essentially erased her past and previous life. When Sarah called her father, he was surprised but happy because, after all these years, he finally knew that his daughter was still alive, and he had hope of seeing her again. He asked her why she couldn't return home and told her that the threats from the Irish army had stopped, and the organization she had been involved with was on the path to dissolving and integrating into political society, meaning the threat was no longer there. However, Sarah gave no explanation, simply stating that she couldn't return and needed her money because it was Robert's instruction. Her father refused her request and asked her to come back home, so Robert hung up on him, just like last time. But this time, his strategy was different. He decided to make Sarah call her father continuously, pressuring him to give her the inheritance. Sarah, who was like a puppet willing to do anything Robert told her, kept calling him day and night, with the same conversation repeating, her father asking her to return, and Sarah asking for the money. The phone at Sarah's father's house kept ringing non-stop, and the situation felt like they were living in a horror movie. It went from a long period of no contact to constant pressure. The person most affected by this was not Sarah's father, but her mother. The mother was overwhelmed with sadness, unable to understand how her daughter had reached such a state, and every time the phone rang, it felt like her heart was burning more. Her mental state deteriorated, and she became emotionally broken. When Sarah's father saw the condition his wife was in, he decided to pay the required amount to get rid of the hell they were living in because of that despicable creature, Robert. In the last call between him and Sarah, he told her, I don't want to hear your voice again. Don't contact us. Take this money and consider our relationship over." The words the father spoke were harsh, but at that moment, he had lost hope in his daughter and was also worried about his wife. That's why these words came out, even though he didn't mean them from the bottom of his heart. Years passed, and it was now 2001, meaning 9 years had passed since the beginning of the escape journey. Even though the father told his daughter not to communicate with them again, he eventually regretted this. A father's heart can never truly abandon his daughter. He kept searching and trying to follow up, even contacting the police several times, but to no avail. The father felt tied down and had no means, no place to turn to, and no one to help him. But suddenly, after all these years, he received a letter in the mail. The letter was from John. In it, John wrote that he had returned to his family years ago, and that for all this time, he had been thinking of writing the letter but felt too ashamed of himself. He felt guilty for involving Sarah with the person who deceived them, and he felt ashamed that Sarah had remained under this person's control even after his escape. Before we continue with the content of the letter, we need to know how John managed to escape. John's family had been paying large sums regularly, under the assumption that it was money for protecting their son, expecting that they would be compensated later by the government or security services. Although there was constant communication between John and his family, his father was suspicious of the whole situation. The main problem was that John was completely convinced by Robert's words, always assuring his family and his father that Robert was indeed an agent in the security services, and that they were being targeted because of their roommate, Jim. However, after 5 years of continuous escape, John's mental state deteriorated. Despite Robert's control over him, he couldn't fix his psychological state. John fell into severe depression, and even though he still believed in the story of being targeted by the Irish army, he decided to return to his family. Robert tried to warn him, saying that he wouldn't be able to protect him if he went back to his family, and that doing so would put them at risk. But John insisted on returning, saying he couldn't endure it anymore, and that if he didn't go back to his family, he would commit suicide. Robert didn't control his victims with physical force, but rather mentally and psychologically. When John made the decision to return, even though he still believed everything Robert had told him, Robert decided to let him go, especially since John's father had become difficult to deal with and refused to keep paying the money like before. Robert felt he had already drained the family of all their money. In fact, John's family had been financially devastated, having paid more than $500,000 to Robert as protection money for their son. When Robert saw John's psychological state worsening, with the threat of suicide, and realized that it was becoming difficult to get more money from the family, he decided to let John return to his family. John returned to his family around the 5th or 6th year of his escape. Even after returning to his family, he still expected to be targeted by the Irish army when he went back to his family. But a year, then 2 years, then 3 years passed, and nothing happened. It was at this point that John realized he had been deceived all those years. Of course, this might make you think that John was foolish and naive, and that assumption might be correct. But the truth is that there are many details we still don't know about what happened from the beginning to the end. No matter how long the story is, in the end, it's just a summary of events that occurred over many years, and it's impossible for us to fully understand all the details, their thought processes, or their mental state at the time. Therefore, we'll always have a puzzling question: how did Robert manage to convince them of all these things over the years? The important part is that after John realized he had been deceived and discovered that Sarah hadn't returned to her family, he felt it was his duty to contact Sarah's father. He wrote him a letter expressing his shame and clarified that Robert had deceived them all these years by frightening them about the Irish army, convincing them they were targeted. However, John only realized the truth after losing a huge fortune, which led to his family's downfall and dragged innocent girls like Sarah and Maria into the mess. In the letter, John apologized for everything that happened and stated that he didn't know where Sarah was because Robert had separated them many years ago. Although the letter didn't contain new information for Sarah's father, it clearly confirmed that Robert was a con artist who manipulated them for money. Sarah's father thought that this statement from someone who was involved in the events might help the police in the investigation. Previously, the police had always told him there was no kidnapping and that they had no involvement in the matter. But John's statement confirmed there was manipulation, so Sarah's father tried once again to contact the police. The surprise was that there was indeed an open case against Robert, and a detective named Bob Brandon had been following it. The question now is, what is this case, and how did it open? Who filed the complaint against Robert? The truth is that another woman named Caroline had filed a complaint against her ex-fiancé, Robert Freyard, accusing him of fraud and stealing over £30,000 from her. After the investigation, they discovered that John, Sarah, and Maria weren't the only victims of Robert over the past 10 years. Robert had deceived many women in different ways and stole substantial amounts from them. The police, especially Detective Bob, began to follow Robert's trail and discovered that, in the recent years before 2002, he worked at a car dealership in London. When they went to inquire about him at the dealership, they learned that Robert had left the job some time ago. However, the police questioned his colleagues to learn more about him, and they said he was very clever with his words and knew how to sell. He often won the Best Seller of the Month award and showed a special interest in the customers, always going to them first. This made him one of the most successful salespeople at the dealership. Most of Robert's clients were women, and among them was a woman named Caroline, who filed a complaint against him. He met her at the exhibition and managed to build a relationship with her, convincing her to marry him and proposing. In the end, he managed to manipulate her using his usual tactics and stole more than £3,000 from her. One of Robert's colleagues at the exhibition told the police that Robert had revealed to him that his car sales job was just a cover, and his real work was as an agent for the British Security Service. His mission was to uncover Irish Army agents in the area. Initially, his colleague did not believe him, but he began to notice certain behaviors that made him suspect something. Robert was constantly changing his phone number, swapping SIM cards, and moving from one address to another. He never stayed at the same place for long. Sometimes, he would go to hotels or houses and claim he had meetings there. His colleague would drive him to these places and noticed that Robert would stay for about half an hour to an hour before leaving. It's likely that these places were where some of his victims, like John, Sarah, Maria, and others, were staying. Although his colleague did not believe him at first, he began to believe it as he continued to monitor Robert's behavior. However, the police and Detective Bob knew that this was all a lie, because any real agent of the security services wouldn't disclose their identity. To confirm, they contacted the MI5 security agency, who assured them that Robert was not an agent. At that point, the police realized they were dealing with a unique conman. The strange thing was that Robert moved as if he were an actual agent or spy, leaving no trace behind. His phone numbers always changed, and his addresses were constantly different. When Sarah's father contacted the police and told Detective Bob everything about John, Maria, and his daughter Sarah, who had been missing for 10 years, and about the large sums of money they had paid to Robert, Detective Bob was shocked. Initially, he thought the case involved just one woman and a $3,000 amount, But suddenly the case turned into something much bigger. 3 people had been missing for 10 years, and the amounts of money involved exceeded £1 million. Detective Bob also realized there might be other victims who were unaware of the situation. Bob promised Sarah's father that he wouldn't rest until he caught the criminal and brought his daughter back. For the first time in years, Sarah's father felt that someone had finally listened to him, and a glimmer of hope began to fill his heart that he might see his daughter again. Robert deceived her again by telling her that he was actually a spy working for the British intelligence service and that his work at the car show was just a cover. He convinced her that he revealed the truth to her because she was the person he loved and wanted to spend his life with. Kim Adams was so impressed with him and loved him so much that she didn't doubt his words and believed him immediately. He had incredible persuasive power and excessive self-confidence, which are essential traits of a con artist. Later, Robert traveled with Kim to the United States, where he met her family and got to know them. While there, he bought her an expensive Rolex watch and a diamond ring to show her and her family that he was serious about their relationship and financially well off. However, his real intention was to later take more from them, meaning he wasn't planning on just giving her these gifts freely. Thus, Robert's relationship with Kim Adams became very strong, and her family grew close to and respected him. Eventually, they gave their full approval for their marriage. Robert told them once again that he worked for the British intelligence service, and they believed him because he appeared to them as a strong, handsome, successful man with high self-confidence. No one doubted his words. He also told them that there were certain conditions that must be met for anyone wanting to marry an intelligence officer. He began talking about the training and tests that Kim would have to undergo to be approved for marriage, and he convinced her that she could become a spy and work with him in the future. Kim became excited about the idea, feeling like she would lead an exciting life as a spy alongside Robert. Her family encouraged her, and they fully supported their marriage. Robert returned to Britain with his new fiancée, Cam, and began to execute his real plan on her. The first thing he told her was that they needed to leave their current location because he had a mission in another place. He explained that his task in this place was over. During this time, Robert left his job at the car dealership, while Cam worked at a clinic in London, rented an apartment, and had colleagues and friends. He told her she needed to inform them that she had a serious illness and would be relocating due to her health condition, to avoid raising any suspicion about her sudden disappearance. After that, Robert and Cam moved to several cities, not just in Britain but across Europe. During this period, Robert applied the same psychological manipulation techniques he used with his previous victims, trying to reshape her personality to make her completely submissive to him. He had her contact her family multiple times, asking for money for various reasons, each time giving a new excuse. Meanwhile, Detective Bob and his team were trying to trace Cam, as they had managed to link her to Robert through the car dealership where he worked, as she was one of his clients. When they discovered Robert's address, the landlord of the apartment Cam had been renting told them that Cam had informed him of her sudden illness and her need to move because of it. Her colleagues at the clinic told the same story. This led Detective Bob to realize that this was the same tactic Robert used with his previous victim, John, where he convinced him to tell people around him that he had cancer and was living his final months. Bob began to believe that Cam was likely Robert's new victim. Unfortunately, they did not have enough evidence to follow up directly. So, Detective Bob reached out to an investigator he knew at the FBI in the US and asked her to contact Cam's family in Arizona to inquire about their daughter and if they knew anything about Robert and his relationship with her. The family informed the FBI agents that they knew about Robert and that Cam was planning to marry him. They were told that Robert claimed to work as an agent for the British security services, and her parents believed that their daughter would have a happy life with him. They were shocked when the FBI informed them that Robert was actually a dangerous con artist. It became clearer to the investigators when they learned that Cam's father had won $15 million in the lottery, explaining why Robert targeted his daughter. The family did not know exactly where Cam and Robert were, only that they had been moving between different cities due to Robert's alleged work in security services. They also informed the FBI that Cam had been calling them occasionally, asking for money and claiming that she was undergoing training and would soon take tests to join Robert in his work. This was the story they had been told. The FBI has decided to start monitoring and recording the calls between the parents of Yem and Robert, as they had been in contact with each other from time to time. What you will hear now is a real recording of a call that took place between Robert and the father of Cam, whose name is different from John, who we mentioned earlier, so don't confuse them. Let's listen to the call now, and keep in mind that Robert told Cam's parents that he would take her under his wing, train her, and then have her take tests to become a spy like him. However, these tests come with a cost. The following was said in the call. "Hi, how are you? I just got back from London, where I was there to train on some matters related to the British government. The test I took was very difficult. It's related to the ISO 9002 standard, which is a very complex British quality standard to explain. Unfortunately, I failed it twice. However, there's a chance to take it for the third time, but the big issue is that we have to pay to retake the exam, and that's really frustrating." As you heard, Robert was saying that he is failing the tests and that these tests are costly. He mentioned that he's paying large amounts of money out of his own pocket. In this call, Robert seemed to be dodging the issue. It's important to note that the FBI was present during the call and they were listening to him. Instead of committing to pay, Robert was trying to delay and avoid giving a straight answer. This is when it became clear that Robert was starting to feel desperate. The following was said in the call. "Whatever I am just saying to you, hand on my heart that I spoke to thee on the phone, I literally scrapped my barrel. You know that 61,000 cleared out everything I had. Well, just bear one thing in mind if you want to help out, which is very, very honorable. Just bear in mind we have till Tuesday to actually sort this exam, and you know that is like yeah, that's quick." You saw how Robert started speaking with a tone of despair, as if saying, "I've exhausted everything I have, and we don't have time. Our last day is Tuesday, and if we don't get the money by then, the opportunity will be lost." His tone sounded hopeless, and it seemed like he was trying to cling to any chance available. To put more pressure on them, he played on the emotional side, asking Cam to call her mother in and try to get her to help. In the recording of the call between Cam and her mother, it was clear that Cam was trying to plead with her mother, explaining the difficult situation she was in. Through FBI analysis, it was evident that Cam was speaking as though she were reading from a script, and Robert had coached her with these words and written them for her. This was something Robert also did with his previous victims, like John, Sarah, and Maria, by coaching them on what to say to their families. Cam wasn't just asking for money for the tests. Sometimes she'd claim random reasons, such as her car breaking down and needing money for repairs. It was clear that all of these requests were prompted by Robert. Meanwhile, the FBI was recording these calls and analyzing them to track Robert's movements. There was direct communication between the FBI and the British police, especially with Detective Bob, who was handling the case. The British police started tracking the money transfers that Cam's family sent her, and they looked into her bank accounts to see where the money was being spent. They noticed that the spending was happening in several cities in European countries, including the UK, Germany, Austria, and France. They also saw that they never stayed in one city for more than 2 nights. Robert was following his old pattern of constantly moving from one place to another, making it very difficult to track him. Even though the police had issued a lookout for him, he was able to travel from city to city and country to country without getting caught. This confirmed that he was using fake identities. Whenever they checked into hotels or other places, they always used fake names instead of their real ones. Detective Bob and his team knew that tracking down Robert would be difficult, so they decided to lure him into a trap. If there was one thing Robert wanted, it was money. In coordination with the police and the FBI, they decided to have the Cam family contact Robert and inform him that they were willing to give him a large sum of $10,000 to cover the costs of their daughter's tests at the spy school. However, there was a condition: the money had to be handed over in person, face to face, because the amount was significant, and they also wanted to see their daughter, especially her mother, who hadn't seen her in a long time. Cam's mother reached out to Robert and told him that she would meet him at Heathrow Airport to hand over the money. Robert agreed to the meeting, and the police and security agencies began preparing. Agents were deployed all over the airport, monitoring the situation both on the ground and through cameras. When Cam's mother arrived at the airport and picked up her luggage from the baggage claim, the police were able to pinpoint Robert's location. The agreement between Cam and Robert was that they would meet at a specific cafe in the airport, and they indeed met there as seen in the images. Up to this point, Cam has not appeared. It was clear that Robert came alone, walking with Cam through the airport. Suddenly, they stopped. Cam asked for permission to go to the bathroom, and from there, she called Detective Bob. Cam was extremely nervous, her voice trembling, as she was not used to such situations, and her heart was racing. Detective Bob tried to calm her down, telling her to take a deep breath and let him know what had happened between them. Cam told him that Robert informed her that Cam was waiting in the car in the parking lot, and they were supposed to head there after leaving. Detective Bob reassured her that he and his team were monitoring the situation and everything was under control, advising her to go with Robert to the car. Cam left the bathroom, returned to Robert, and they headed together toward the parking lot. The surveillance team had already located their car, and they noticed a woman sitting in the car. Once they confirmed that it was likely Cam, Detective Bob gave the order for the arrest team to act immediately. In an instant, the place was filled with undercover agents and security officers, and Robert was arrested while mother of Cam and her daughter were secured. Detective Bob was the first to sit down with Robert in the interrogation room. He asked many questions about Robert's relationship with Cam and confronted him about the spy training and claims of working for the security service, but Robert kept responding with no comment. The detective asked about individuals like John, Maria, and Sarah, and the events involving them over the past 10 years, but Robert denied everything. He also asked about the fate of Sarah Smith and her whereabouts, but Robert refused to cooperate and denied all the charges. After his arrest, two important things were found in Robert's pocket. The first was a card with the name Rayoni and a phone number written on it. This card was important and will be revisited later in the story. The second significant item was a set of keys, which belonged to a hotel room in a place called Buffalo in France, located in the French Alps. They went to the hotel, found the room where Robert had stayed, and entered it. Inside the room, they found his personal belongings, including expensive watches and shoes from international brands. They also discovered a locked suitcase, and upon opening it, they found a treasure trove of important documents that would assist in the case. Among these documents were passports, letters, bills, credit cards, and driving licenses belonging to different women. These identities included names unknown to the investigators, such as Elizabeth Bartholomew, Leslie Gardner, and Renata Kister. These three women were also among Robert's victims. It became clear that Robert was managing multiple victims simultaneously and had a unique method of exploiting them. One of the victims, Elizabeth Bartholomew, had a particularly tragic story. Her story began in 1996 when she was newly married. Robert managed to seduce her and started an illicit affair with her. He then threatened to send compromising pictures of her to her husband if she didn't continue seeing him. He kept extorting money from her, and eventually convinced her to leave her husband and promised to marry her. He made her change her name, phone number, and sever all ties with the people she knew. After she ran away with him, he asked her to take out loans from the bank, claiming the money would be used for their wedding and starting a new life together. However, after taking the money, he abandoned her in cheap hotels, without money or food, often disappearing for weeks, leaving her to fend for herself. Once, Robert left her in a park in the middle of London without money, food, or anyone to help her. She had to sleep outside in the cold for several days, as she herself stated, and was forced to survive on a Mars chocolate bar for an entire week. In the end, Robert didn't marry her but turned her life into a living hell. Some might say she deserved it because she betrayed her husband, but the truth is that Robert was not just an ordinary con man. He had exceptional skills in persuasion and manipulation. He knew exactly how to choose victims he could easily control. Elizabeth Lumia was one of the victims who suffered for years due to Robert's actions, and she was the most severely affected. Her story was similar to that of many other victims. Sarah was also one of the victims who endured great suffering. She remained under Robert's control for 10 years. Even Maria, who married Robert and had 2 children with him, lived a life full of problems and difficulties. Eventually, she discovered that Robert was having relationships with other women, who were also his victims, and decided to leave him and return to her family. Sarah, on the other hand, lived under constant pressure throughout those years. Robert controlled her, taking all the money she earned from her job at a fast food restaurant. She lived in extreme conditions, with no friends, no family, and no identity. Her life revolved around following Robert's orders. He would move her from place to place under the pretense that the Irish army was targeting her, covering her head with a bag as if it were part of security precautions. On one occasion, he forced her to stay in one of the houses he called safe houses, which he used for his secretive activities. He told her to stay in the bathroom and not to leave, then closed the door behind her without locking it. He left her there for days without food or anything. The whole purpose of these actions was to break her down psychologically and physically. When he returned after several days, he took her out of the bathroom, gave her some food, and made her feel like he was her savior. Then, he asked her if she wanted to be his girlfriend, and in her weakened, brainwashed state, she agreed, which allowed him to gain what he wanted with her full consent. His goal all along was to destroy her will and make her follow him willingly, and he succeeded in completely destroying her life. Robert destroyed every bit of will and awareness in his victims. After Abu Sarah told Detective Bob about her story, he tried to search for Sarah, but there was no trace of her. As mentioned earlier, Robert always made his victims use fake names to the point where they forgot their true identities. Sarah had no phone number, address, bank account, or any government transactions. He made her live like a ghost with no existence. When Robert was finally arrested, he continued to refuse to cooperate with the police and denied all the charges against him. However, after his arrest, they found a card in his pocket with the name Roni and a phone number. It turned out that Roni was actually Renata Keister, another one of Robert's victims. The police identified her through her passport and ID card, which were found inside Robert's bag at a hotel in the French Alps. The police contacted Renata and asked her if she knew Robert, but he had already told her beforehand to deny knowing him if anyone asked. At first, Renata hesitated to cooperate with the police, but when she learned they had found her identity documents in Robert's bag, she agreed to cooperate. She came to the police station and shared her story with them. She explained that she met him in 2000 through a car exhibition, where she bought a car from him, and they later had an intermittent relationship. During that time, he managed to take up to £200,000 from her. He told her the same usual story, claiming to be a spy for the security service and that the government would return her money. A few months ago, Robert contacted her after a long period of silence, telling her that there was a woman in need of a place to stay temporarily and that she could help her with household chores. Renata agreed, and she said this woman, named Carrie, was currently working as a house cleaner at her place and living with her. She showed them a photo she had taken of the woman herself. When Detective Bob saw the photo, he immediately felt that this woman might be Sarah, as the resemblance was striking. Detective Bob, along with Renita, went to Sarah's house to meet her. As soon as she opened the door, he immediately recognized her as Sarah. The first word he said was, "Hello, Sarah." Upon hearing this name, Sarah was shocked and started to tremble. It had been years since she had heard that name, and it felt like a name belonging to someone else from her past. She suddenly felt as if the name wasn't hers. The detective tried to calm her down and explained that everything had been a deception. He assured her that Robert was not a spy or an agent in the security service, but just a con artist who had been arrested. Everything he had told her was a lie from the start. In the end, the detective told Sarah that she would be coming with him. At that moment, Sarah was in total shock, her head spinning, unable to grasp what was happening. She could barely stand. At the police station, the detective tried to calm her even more and began explaining Robert's crimes, the number of his victims, and how he had been deceiving people. This revelation was like waking up from a nightmare. But Sarah realized she had wasted 10 years of her life because of this con artist, and those years led to the loss of her future, education, career, and personal relationships. She had spent those years living in fear, pain, and suffering, with no goal or hope. And all of this was for a small amount of money that Robert had stolen from her. Afterward, the police contacted her family, and when they reunited, the joy was overwhelming. They embraced her warmly, and despite everything that had happened, their happiness was indescribable. After Sarah's return to her family, the police continued their investigation and managed to find other victims, such as Elizabeth Bartholomew and Leslie Gardner. They believed there were other victims they hadn't reached yet, like a Brazilian woman whose identity had been found in Robert's bag at the hotel. There were also other unidentified victims. The case continued for 3 years, with Robert remaining in jail during that time. In 2005, he was put on trial, where all the evidence collected by the investigators and testimonies from victims were presented. He was charged with kidnapping, theft, and fraud, and the court concluded that the amount of money he had stolen reached £1 million. However, Robert continued to deny all charges in court, even attempting to twist the facts and place the blame on the victims. He claimed that John was the real con artist and that he had contracted AIDS due to his involvement in homosexual activities. He also accused his wife Maria of mistreating their daughters and spending money wastefully. He alleged that Elizabeth had cheated on her husband and had pursued him for an affair. As for the American woman who was his fiancée, he claimed she had cheated on him with several men, manipulating him into believing she loved him so she could take his money. Despite all the evidence against him and the numerous victims who testified against him, Robert Freegard was sentenced to life in prison after several months of court hearings. This was the minimum sentence someone like him could receive, as he was a dangerous criminal who destroys people's lives. He should never be released from prison, and the story should have ended there. But as we all know, the story I told you at the beginning of the video, which took place in 2012, means that Robert Hendy Freegard would eventually be released from prison. In 2007, Robert and his lawyers filed an appeal to the Court of Appeals, which is the court that re-examines cases and sentences. The main defense they used was that the victims were not actually kidnapped, they had the freedom to leave whenever they wanted. The main charge against Maria, his ex-wife, was kidnapping, which resulted in a life sentence. When the kidnapping charge was dropped, the other charges led to only a 7-year sentence. Since he had been in custody since 2002, he had already served his sentence by 2009, and he was released that year. This ruling was a shock to the victims and investigators who worked on the case. How could someone so obviously guilty of such devastating crimes, which ruined so many lives, receive such a lenient sentence? But in the end, there was nothing anyone could do since the court's ruling was the law. After Robert Freegard's release in 2009, some people may have hoped that he would repent. However, someone like him would never change. This is just the way he lives. Now, let's return to the story we started the video with, the story of Mark, Sandra, and their children, Jake and Sophie. Robert entered their lives under the name David Hendy and began dating Sandra, manipulating and controlling her in sneaky ways. He then started to tear the family apart, forcing Jake to leave the house while isolating him from his mother and sister, Sophie. He also manipulated Sophie and drained all her money. After that, as we mentioned, Sophie left the house, and eventually, she was reunited with her father and brother. Meanwhile, Robert and Sandra disappeared from the house. Mark, the father, eventually figured out that the person who had been calling himself David was actually the dangerous conman, Robert Freegard. After discovering Robert's true identity, Mark told them everything that had happened to them over the years. The police listened to his story, but at first, they weren't interested in investigating the case. Mark kept pressing them, repeatedly visiting different departments, and eventually, after several attempts, they agreed to investigate. This happened in 2015, and they began looking for Sandra as a missing person. Eventually, they managed to locate her and discovered that she was living with Robert. The police approached Sandra and informed her about the truth regarding Robert. They revealed that he was a fraudster, convicted and imprisoned in the past for various crimes. They also mentioned that he was dangerous and even mentally unstable. They asked Sandra if she knew him and what he had done, and she replied that she knew him well and had chosen to stay with him of her own free will. The police offered to protect her and take her away from him, but she refused, saying she wanted to stay with him. The police had no choice but to respect her decision, as it was her free will. When the news reached Mark and the children from the police, they were shocked and couldn't understand how Robert had gained such control over their mother. Years passed, and Sandra occasionally made random calls to her children, maybe once or twice a year, using a hidden number. However, when they spoke to her, they felt as though they were talking to a stranger, not their mother. Then, Sandra's parents passed away, and the surprise was that she didn't attend either of their funerals. In 2020, after their deaths, Sandra was supposed to inherit their house, worth £300,000. However, Jake, Sandra's son, decided to try and keep the house under his care because he knew Robert would try to seize it through his mother. The bigger shock came when Sandra filed a lawsuit against her son to reclaim the house, which she was supposed to inherit from her parents, even though she hadn't attended their funerals. This case took place during the COVID-19 pandemic, with court sessions held via video calls. This was the first time Jake had seen his mother in 7 years, through these court hearings. Throughout the sessions, Sandra insisted on accusing her son of stealing from her, claiming he had always stolen from her, even though all Jake was trying to do was protect the house and prevent Robert from taking it. Jake tried to explain his position to the judge, asserting that his mother was being manipulated by Robert, who had a criminal history. Although the judge seemed to favor the son's side after hearing all the details, according to the law, he was required to give the house to the mother, as she was the rightful owner based on investigations and news reports. At that time, Robert and Sandra were living in France, and Robert was working in the field of selling purebred dogs, specifically beagles. According to warnings posted by some individuals in the dog breeding community on Reddit, Robert was known as a dangerous scammer. He used aliases such as David Clifton and the nickname the Bloodmaster and participated in beagle dog shows. Warnings were shared to alert dog breeders not to deal with him. One of his victims was a beagle breeder who was contacted by Robert under the name David Clifton, claiming to be an expert in beagles and offering to help her improve the quality of her dogs. She began dealing with him, and he started selling her beagles from France. However, she discovered that he was scamming her by charging fake fees for veterinary treatment and vaccinations. She was paying him money that was supposed to go to the vet for the dog's care. This incident occurred in 2021. Later, Robert's name became more widely known after several of his scams were exposed. In 2021, a Reddit user wrote a comment warning about Robert's attempt to scam the parents of his friend's girlfriend. He tried to sell them a beagle in a very emotional way, claiming he had cancer and financial problems. According to the latest news in August 2022, French police were investigating a report about a person breeding and selling beagle dogs using illegal methods. When the police approached him, he attempted to escape in his Audi car. During the escape, he ran over 2 police officers, injuring one of them seriously. As a result, the French police intensified their efforts to chase Robert, with 2 helicopters joining the search and pursuit operations. Sandra was detained by the police and interrogated because she was considered Robert's partner. This is a recent photo of her from 2022. Walking one of the beagle dogs after she cooperated with the police and helped them identify locations where Robert might go. Robert remained on the run for several days, and there was an international alert for his arrest, not only in France but across all of Europe due to open borders. His intentional injuring of police officers while fleeing made him a high-priority target. After 8 days from the police hit-and-run incident, he was arrested in Belgium at one of the checkpoints in September 2022, and in October of the same year, he was handed over to French authorities to face trial. Since then, it appears that Robert is still in French prisons, and no final judgment has been issued in his case yet. Investigations are ongoing, and news reports indicate that he faces more than 30 charges, including fraud and attempted murder of police officers. We hope these charges will lead to him being imprisoned for life. As for Sandra, there are no new updates about her, and it's unclear whether she has returned to her family. With that, we've almost concluded the story, which is one of the strangest and most complex stories I have covered on the channel. The story may seem unbelievable, but there are multiple sources confirming these events. If you'd like, you can search for more details yourself as information is widely available online. On the other hand, it's hard to comprehend how Robert managed to deceive his victims over all these years, especially the students. How did he manage to convince them that they were being chased and in danger for such a long time? How did he exploit their innocence and naivety, robbing them of their money without them suspecting anything? Ultimately, some might argue that the victims were simply naive, and there might be some truth to that. However, What's more important is that Robert carefully selected his victims, studied them, and found their weaknesses. The key factor in this whole situation was most likely his ability to deceive and manipulate, as he managed to affect a large number of people. This deception built up over time, and after the first lie was believed, the victim would make more sacrifices in hopes of recovering what they had lost. Even when things became stranger, the victim continued to believe the lie, thinking there was a logical reason for everything that had happened. It's like a person who keeps gambling, hoping to recover their losses, even when the lie grows over time. The human mind refuses to face painful reality, so it continues to justify the losses and pain it's gone through, because escaping this cycle means admitting that everything that happened was in vain. This could break a person entirely, but the mind tries to protect them by keeping them trapped in the lie, even if doubts increase. It may seem complex, but this is the impact of deception on the human psyche. This is all just my personal analysis, and whether it's right or wrong, God knows best. You too, share your opinions and write your analysis of what happened in the end in the comments below. If you liked the story, don't forget to support us with a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell button so you receive all new content as soon as it's available. If you'd like, there are previous wonderful stories you can enjoy. Thank you for following. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.